If bank reform is so important, why aren't our politicians talking about it?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I wish I knew the answer. They should be. But I guess they're like the public at large. They're not into it. They weren't educated into it, and they're not into it. And they just go along with the solutions that are presented to them from various quarters, which don't include the kind of solutions that have to really be put into place if they want to solve the problems for the ordinary 99% of the people. So I do know that there's a lack of interest amongst politicians, because heaven only knows, I should know. I've tried a dozen ways to get through to them and say, look, just take a little time off to learn about this. And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And that is, my opinion, irresponsible, and I think they should be held accountable for it. But somehow we've got to educate people to the point where they can hold them accountable, because they know that there's a better way if they would just adopt it.
Mm-hmm. Who owns the private international banks Canadians pay interest to for creating our money?
The international banks, well, they're owned by a lot of people, as are ordinary banks. But the big international banks, the cartel, as it were, are owned by, I would say, mostly the 62 families that own half the world now. Right at the top, the apex of the cabal of the New World Order. And they're the power brokers. They have trillions of dollars, many of them, and they're big money people. And so when we talk about the rich elite, that's really who we're talking about.
Often overlooked are the differences between the Canadian and United States monetary policy and banking structure. Are you able to briefly explain some of the main differences on the two systems?
It's a difficult question to answer briefly, but the brief answer is that we own the Bank of Canada. The Americans do not own the Federal Reserve System. It is owned by private banks. And this was one of the worst mistakes that the US ever made. In my books, I call it the biggest heist in history, because a little over 103 years ago, they turned over their right to create their own money to several of the richest, most powerful bankers in the world. And why they would do that, I don't know. It was done at Christmas time. Maybe everyone was thinking about sugar plum fairies instead of worrying about the people. But it was done. It was recognized that it was a mistake. But over 100 years later, it's still not changed. It has to be nationalized. It has to be wound up. And they have to have a central bank that they own like we own ours. But it's not going to happen in the United States, I think, as long as they can make very large contributions to political parties and individual candidates at election time. So they would have to change their laws about political donations before they have much chance of making this critical decision on ownership of their central bank. But if we could lead the way, of course, that would be some pressure on them down there to start taking the whole matter seriously.